Well, last week on Easter Sunday, I told a story of a rabbi and his wife whose very risky but very tenacious love completely turned around the life of a racist Ku Klux Klan leader. And it was a true story that featured a really dramatic transformation of a person. And we like those kind of stories. We like those stories where a really bad person or a person who has made a wreck of their lives suddenly sees the light or gets themselves saved and turns around their life. It makes for a good book. It makes for a good movie. It makes for a good story. It makes for a good children's story, like The Grinch, whose heart suddenly grew. But I think most of us know that transformation and change isn't usually like that. Most transformation is very gradual, very slow, subtle, sometimes glacial. And it's happening all around us all the time. As every child and every parent knows who has a growth chart on the wall, occasionally there's a growth spurt, but usually you don't really notice it until you stand that child up against the wall and you think, wow, a lot has happened in the last year. And even as adults, whenever that kind of growth stops, and sometimes other kinds takes over, regardless, we replace our skin cells every 35 days and our blood every 120. And we don't even know it's happening, but it is happening. And in ways both literal and figurative, we are not the same people today that we were a year ago. We have all changed in very subtle ways. Nature sometimes fools us into thinking that change happens suddenly when we go from brown to green. And we get that first wonderful flush of new growth in the spring. It certainly appears dramatic, and it's wonderful. But of course, the plants are growing all year long. And even when they are dormant in winter, there is growth and change happening at the cellular level. Slow, constant change year after year after year. Is of course neutral. It's not good, it's not bad, it is. Our bodies are changing all the time, nature is changing around us all the time. Change like that, subtle, slow, but steady, is a part of our lives. Most transformation of the spiritual and emotional kind is also slow and gradual. For every dramatic conversion story, there are thousands more of us whose spiritual and emotional growth is measured like the rings of a huge oak tree that has taken year after year and then decade after decade to get to where it is. In our book group right now, we are reading a book by David Brooks called The Social Animal. And last week we were talking about some of the statistics and observations Brooks makes about families in poor communities, comparing them to families in more wealthy communities. And he talks about how different the culture is. I mean, incredibly different the culture is. And therefore how difficult it is to help individuals change when so much seems to be stacked against them in that culture. And while we were talking, Laura Natson was talking about working with, was it Big Brother? Big Brothers and Big Sisters. And, trying to make a difference with one person at a time. And then talking about how do you know? I mean, you do what you can with one person, and how do you know? It helps. And Steve commented that in his experience working with homeless individuals, you measure progress in decades. Day by day, it may be difficult to see change, but when you can widen out the time frame long enough and look in from time to time, then you get to see that change happen. Slow and gradual. Which requires enormous amounts of patience and lots of persistence and lots of love. And which is also why we like that dramatic turnaround every once in a while, because you can see it right before your eyes. But when you're talking about growing emotionally, or growing in love and wisdom, or when you're talking about spiritual growth, the truth is there really are no shortcuts. It takes time. Change and growth is gradual. And it also isn't linear. It isn't a matter of going onward and upward, climbing that hill and reaching the top. The truth is that it's full of ups and downs. And I think it's better when we're thinking about growing in that way to think of growth in terms of depth, rather than growing to be the best or growing great or even growing up. What we want as that time goes on and as that change happens is we want depth. The depth that comes from learning to navigate the ups and the downs of life. Most of the resurrection stories that are found in the Bible are of the dramatic variety. So they're dramatic stories. My favorite resurrection story in the Gospels is the one that's found only in Luke, and it goes like this. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and walked with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he asked them, "What were you discussing with each other while you were walking along?" And they stood still, looking sad. And then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered Jesus and said, "Are you the only person in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place here in these days?" Jesus said, "What things?" And they replied, "These things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. And how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. And moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find the body, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they didn't see him." Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in the Scriptures. And as they came near the village to where they were going, he walked ahead of them as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us. It is almost evening, and day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them, and when he was at the table with them, he took bread, he blessed it and broke it, and he gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and then he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning with us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the Scriptures